So, welcome everyone. Tonight we are looking at Decay, and when we chose this topic, I should think it was about 6 months ago, little did we know that truth decay would be hitting the headlines on a daily basis in the British national press. It is a sad surprise for us that we have this coincidence, but there you go. That is where we're at. The edition, which was the November edition of Friends Quarterly, included 4 articles, and we have invited one of the authors, John Lampen, to join us this evening. And we've also invited Georgina Bailey, who is a Britain Yearly Meeting trustee, amongst many other things, but works in a context where truth is, as a journalist. Let's say that, Georgina, you work in as a journalist.
Yeah.
Where truth is particularly pertinent. So, I don't know, John, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm not quite sure what to say. I've been a Quaker since my mid-20s, and I've been very lucky. Life's given me an opportunity to work in settings where I was putting my Quaker beliefs and principles into practice, like in the conflict in Northern Ireland, developing working with Lampen and so on. To the serious stuff.
Okay. Georgina, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Georgina Bailey. I was born into a Quaker family. I have heard some of my family's names popping up today, so thank you for coming to watch me and be part of this. But so as Gill said, I am a Britain Yearly Meeting trustee. I've been doing that for 3 years now. I grew up in a Quaker meeting in South London. I'm now part of a Quaker meeting in West London. And I'm also a political journalist. So I have to stay quite neutral on most things. So if you think, oh, she's not expressing as many opinions as usual tonight, it's because it's being recorded and I have to be neutral. Yeah, so as Gill says, that is something that massively ties in to truth. I think most journalists, despite what you might hear about us, do see our primary responsibility to being towards the truth. And I was actually going through McNay's the other day, which is the journalist's kind of basically media law guide that every journalist has on their desk. And it says there that our kind of key principles should be honesty, fairness and accuracy. And I think that is something that has really guided most journalists in their work around truth decay. And I think it kind of does, particularly in these kind of social media world where so much of our work is online, it does provide quite an interesting challenge sometimes. So I'm looking forward to talking a bit more about that later. Oh, you're now on mute.
I'm muted. Olivia, if you'd like to introduce yourself and lead us into the first question, please.
Absolutely. So I'm Olivia, Risley. Along with Gill, I'm one of the editors of Friends Quarterly. Very excited that we're continuing this Woodbrook collaboration today with another chat with one of our writers and bringing in Georgina very excitingly. So I wanted really to open by reflecting back the question that you very kindly wrote for us, John, to put in the discussion question pages of the Friends Quarterly. And kind of just to start us off, how do you understand the phrase doing the truth? And that's for you, John and Georgina. If we maybe start with John, how do you understand the phrase doing the truth?
Okay. Well, the first thing I want to say about it is that it's a fuzzy truth. And I'm very keen on fuzzy logic rather than rigid logic and fuzzy definitions at times. So one of the things I like about it is that it doesn't yield up all its meaning straight away. But one can make quite a clear contrast, even from Quaker history, between saying the truth and doing the truth. I was just looking at one of our Victorian books of discipline, and they quote Meeting for Suffering somewhere around probably mid-19th century, saying, this meeting being sorrowfully affected under a consideration of the hurtful tendency of reading plays, romances, novels, and other pernicious books, earnestly recommends to every member of our society to discourage and suppress the same. And I know where this dislike of fiction was coming from. There was a kind of feeling that fiction could not live up to some Quaker standard of truth that they had in mind. And then I set against that, perhaps, Jesus sitting down and saying, there was a guy who went from Jerusalem to Jericho and he got mugged by thieves. And then he goes on and tells a story about it. Now, those Quakers would never have said, well, Jesus was using fiction, that's wrong. So something strange is happening here. And I think one could put it, Jesus is not telling the truth. Who knows if there ever was such an incident? Jesus is doing the truth by engaging an audience, engaging their imaginations and their thinking in order to explore a problem. So that although saying the truth and doing the truth might look like the same kind of thing, even when you're using words, there's a difference between doing the truth, as a good storyteller does, and saying the truth as perhaps a government communicator does. And I think we get very hung up if all our thinking about whether things are truthful or not is whether the words on the paper or in the air accord with the facts. I think that's all I want to say about it to start.
That's really interesting, John, because when the way that I'd been thinking about this in my head was very much around a values-based system. And when you were talking there about Jesus in the parable, I was like, well, actually what Jesus was doing there was that he was about demonstrating values, and the values that are true to yourselves. And actually, if you were to ask me what is doing the truth, it's about living true to yourself and true to values. And that also means challenging yourself when it comes to living your values and not just taking the easy route. So when I was thinking about what does doing the truth mean, I was reminded of an incident fairly early on in my career where I was actually at a BYM trustees meeting when I got a phone call saying, it was my first Secretary of State interview, the first time I'd ever interviewed anyone that senior, and it was Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary. And I was really, and it was like the Saturday, we need you to interview him on the Monday. And I was so, in my head, I was so torn. I was like, can I do this justice? As a Quaker, the idea of stepping foot into the Ministry of Defence really felt a bit like, oh God, like I'm not sure about this. I'm not sure. And I actually kind of in the breaks around our trustee meeting, I said to some of my fellow trustees, I'm like, I've just got this phone call. They're asking me to go and interview the Secretary of State for Defence on Monday. Like, I'm really like, I think I need to pray on this. Like, what can you help me here? And actually what one of my fellow trustees said to me then was, you have like your duty as a journalist is to go into that space and tell the truth about what you see. And that's your duty as a Quaker as well. And so even though it might have felt like at one point, it would have felt like maybe actually that kind of balance between the values, my Quaker values and my values as a journalist, I felt maybe they were going to clash. Actually, they were completely coherent. And actually for me, doing the truth in that scenario was going in, spending my entire weekend researching for this interview, so I was thoroughly prepared as I could be, and going in and asking the challenging questions that was my job as a journalist to do, and almost leaving some of the Quaker stuff a little bit to the side, because actually that for me then was doing the truth. And if we just go through our lives not challenging ourselves on our values or just taking the easy route, then we're not doing the truth at all. That's kind of where I fell on it.
That's a wonderful example, Georgina. But in addition to that, I want to point out that you unconsciously endorsed what I was saying right at the beginning when you used the phrase what Jesus was doing. If you'd said what Jesus was saying, you'd have had to go on and make a quite different point.
Well, some very interesting thoughts there. Thanks for setting us up with some different ideas. I guess if you're talking about trying to do the truth in the world, you know, I think in your article, John, you mentioned, you know, we're sort of living in a culture of deception, a culture of lying, you know, what some people call a post-truth society. And you say, John, that, you know, in your article you say, it seems that we're not ready as a yearly meeting to take specific action against the culture of deception. Do you feel that our society, you know, Quaker society, is not called to this at present, or does it reflect a failure in our discernment? And I'd be interested in your thoughts as well, Georgina.
If you were explaining the testimonies to an inquirer, and they were very interested in this concept of faith in action. So, well, your testimony to peace, how do you put that into action? And we could pull a lot of things out of the hat. Yeah, and your testament to sustainability, so and so. Your testimony to equality. Okay? Your testimony to truth. Well, I don't think we've got any programs that address that at all. It's odd, isn't it? And therefore, I don't want to judge our society, particularly, I'm a bit more detached as I get old, and I've never been a member of sufferings. I don't want to judge them, but I have a suspicion that there may be a failure of discernment here. And what a failure of discernment means, perhaps, is not looking hard enough at the situation to allow the Spirit to start to work.
I don't know if I agree with that, because I do sit on sufferings, all trustees, ex officio members, but I think when for a while I've thought that Quaker discipline throughout our structures is failing, and I think that we're not necessarily acting in the way that we should be, are not as familiar with discernment and like with Quaker discipline as we should be. But I think that also relates to the fact that a lot of us as individuals are grappling with our own relationships with the truth. So it's really hard to come to a corporately discerned position on truth and what kind of post-truth means. And I don't think that we necessarily, as individuals living in society as a whole, which is struggling in this kind of post-truth world, that we as individuals are struggling. So corporately, it's really difficult to get somewhere when we as individuals are struggling with something, and the relationship between the two, where corporate discernment can support individuals and individual support corporate discernment, has slightly broken down. But for example, when we're talking about anti-racism work in the yearly meeting, we've seen over the last 8 months, 9 months, the difficulties that friends are having grappling with our own truth about our history and our relationship with slavery. We see it actually on social media, if you're part of Quaker groups, for example. The stories that we seek out and share often tell one perspective of the truth. They're not necessarily like whole truths. And I'm quite disheartened sometimes by what I see friends post, because I think, oh, is this actually the whole truth here? And when we're actually I think sometimes we have got into a bit of a rut of seeking out views that reaffirm our own. And it's hard then to be called to do something corporately that we can't do ourselves. What I do think on the other hand of it is that actually, certainly when it, for example, comes to anti-racism work, when BYM and Woodbrook started taking a bit of a lead on this, or listening to what was going on in meetings and thinking, right, Woodbrook need to put forward a programme, BYM need to do some work on this, then it supported friends as individuals in doing their own work on it. So whether that could work the same on an issue of truth, whether actually there being some work happening elsewhere that then individuals can join in with and then bolster, then I think that is a challenge. But I don't necessarily know. I don't think we are as individuals in the place to take forward this work.
I would agree with most of that, but the phrase "this work" is perhaps a step along a discernment process. It's not the beginning of a discernment process. I remember this wasn't a Quaker program, but it's interesting. It was led by a Quaker, Sewell. They decided to try and discover across the world everyone who was involved at the decision-making level of nuclear power and nuclear weaponry. And different groups then tried to build a conversation with different people, namely about asking them questions and listening to their answers and recording. And all sorts of interesting things followed. This was the group that did it was called the Oxford Research Group. But one thing particularly interests me, as they worked, they often found they were better informed than the officials they were talking to. And in fact, few officials left their jobs as a result of these conversations, which Scylla told me she greatly regretted. She'd far sooner they'd stayed there with the knowledge rather than moving away. But it's an example of something which somebody had an idea of, something that could be tried. And a group of people, not a large group and not the early meeting, gathered around that and took the idea forward. And that's the way I see a lot of our testimonies growing. I think I mentioned the testimony against child soldiers, which led to a major international agreement, but which started with one woman sitting in Geneva meetings. So I'm not trying to say there's a job and we're somehow missing it. I'm saying, have we started to look to see if there is a door which is open at that on this one?
I think you kind of touched on there, I think both of you, about this idea between sort of individual responsibility, the individual seeking out truth, and how that translates into a wider picture, a corporate picture, and the difficulty there. And Georgina, you may have sort of really touched on this already, but I guess I wanted to kind of explore that a bit more. You actually both mentioned meeting sufferings there, which leads very beautifully into my next question, so thank you for that, which was about a 2019 meeting sufferings minute, which you write about in your article, John. And it states in that minute, we have no doubt about the importance of this concern, i.e. truth and integrity, but only about our capacity. What do you feel hinders our capacity as individuals and as a wider body, as a religious society, to seek out and do the truth?
Could Georgina take that one first, please?
Yeah, so I think I've already touched a little bit on the individual aspect of it, and the challenges that we face living in kind of what, like, we live in society as a whole. We are not removed from it. But corporately, let's tell the truth, Quakers are struggling to function as it is. Like, we have an aging and declining membership. If you look at the work of BYM or the other kind of organisations that we rely on to do a lot of our work, those are charities that have been hit very hard by the pandemic. But even before that, these were real struggles that we were facing fundamentally. And if we are lacking the capacity to run our meetings at the most basic level, and we have our volunteers and the people who hold roles in our meetings becoming completely burnt out, then what hope do we have of trying to tackle anything really, but including work on truth? So I do think that if Quakers, and we see this coming up through sufferings, because obviously trustees are the people who hold the budget, but we are part of sufferings and we hear a lot about where people want resources to go. There's almost a point at which you kind of say, actually, we have to put investment and time into supporting Quakers on the most basic level before we can do anything else. And I mean, the other point is, actually, if there are people who wanted to pick up this work and run with it, this doesn't have to be a corporately held capacity. This could be individual friends who have a real interest in truth, decay, or truth and integrity, and they could run with this separately. This doesn't have to be something that's held corporately.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. The peace movement in Northern Ireland started with hundreds of small initiatives. A youth football team competition in one town, which brought together children in teams across the divide. A Presbyterian minister going across the road to say Happy Christmas to a Catholic church. A group actually led by a Quaker friend of mine who set up an impartial committee to examine the administration of justice. Some of these things involve quite large groups like the Coromila community. Some of the initiative of 1, 2, 3 or 4 people. Even the largest one in the end, the Peace People, started as an initiative of 2 women and a man. So at first, there was a lot of, lots of hope, really. People going on trying things, but without any great hope it would succeed. And in the end, it was a movement whose cumulative force was far greater than the sum of its parts. Now, if I remember rightly, 42 meetings had sent minutes which were discussed in that session of sufferings. And sufferings, in a way, said we're not ready or we're not able to suggest something. But if all those 42 meetings, early meetings as well, had set up their own truth project, focusing on some issue or some personal group of people in their own areas, we would have had just what I'm asking for, faith in action, rather than faith expressed through anxiety.
I feel that kind of touches on the point you make in your article, John, when you say that truth is created by an accumulation of action. So it's kind of very much, maybe actually it is about just smaller groups of people, individuals, all kind of snowballing to create a greater effect and kind of living out that truth in the world. I certainly think that's food for thought for all of us.
Yeah.
But I suppose maybe there's oh, sorry, John.
I just want to say, in one of the articles in Friends Quarterly, I read the whole thing again today and I forget which one it was. He talks about the discussions, the arguments and the disagreements we have being part of the truth-finding process. And I absolutely go along with that. We mustn't talk as though we were all agreed at the start what truth is and how to express it. The process is part of the discernment.
That's kind of interesting, leads me to another question I had, which was about, if we are all individually trying to do the truth and we all have our kind of own ideas of it, kind of where does that lead us? Because you talk about Margaret Fell and her saying that the truth is one and the same always. But you also write that modern friends tend to have a more relative kind of view of what truth is. Everyone has their own truth. And there's not kind of one vast universal truth out there that we can all sort of agree with and go along with. So if we are all having these individual thoughts about truth, can we actually encounter any problems with that? Because presumably, if we all have our own ideas, they won't all agree with each other. How do we manage and navigate different truths without necessarily placing them in opposition to each other or in a hierarchy? Is it even possible?
Well, Jesus seems to have believed that the different truths, if pursued sort of honestly and innocently, converge. It wasn't the case that there were thousands of different ones, each of which could be in conflict with all the others. Gandhi believed that truth, again, there would be differences, but there was a kind of convergence, so that the idea of a universal truth, if it's set against your personal concept of truth, there might well be conflict, but that's not the way it ought to happen. Let me read you something, if you don't mind, because in our lifetimes, those of us who are older anyway, there's a kind of experience of this which is worth looking at. This writer says, under the orderly surface of the life of lies, there slumbers the hidden sphere of life in its real aims, of its hidden openness to truth. The effective range of this special power of truth cannot be measured in terms of disciples, voters, or soldiers, because it lies spread out in the fifth column of social consciousness, in the hidden aims of life, in human beings' repressed longings for dignity and fundamental rights, for the realization of their real social and political interests. Now, a passage like that might not carry much conviction if it appeared, say, in The Guardian today, but it was written, as you probably guessed, under one of the communist regimes of Eastern Europe. And in all those countries, if you look at, I'm sorry that Valery hasn't joined us to talk about the experience in Ukraine, but I've been in Ukraine a lot, and I would think it's true there. The more that the official culture was built on lies, the more those words of Havel, which could also be in different words coming from George Fox, from Gandhi, and from other people, that there is a hidden stream of truth in human consciousness. The more repressive the regime you live in, the more it seems to make sense, unless you want to just say the wishful thinking that's great in those places. But I think it does make more sense the more truth is being oppressed. And I just want to link that to a letter that George Fox wrote to a group of Quakers who'd been taken prisoners by Muslims in Algiers. And he said something, I'm not sure if it's from that letter actually or another one, but I'll quote it without going further into that. He said, your sufferings will reach to the hidden truth which the persecutor imprisons in himself. In other words, he's saying every person has a sort of truth touchstone deep inside them. But there are people who lock it away, who put it in a kind of prison inside themselves because they're scared to access it. And of course, it was this belief that sent people like Rufus Jones to try and talk to him.
It's really interesting, and I think I come to it from a much less philosophical perspective, but I almost picture the truth. I think I'd probably be in the Margaret Fell camp of saying the truth is one and the same always, but we see different slithers of truths at different points. So, for example, if the truth was this issue of Friends Quarterly, then we might all see different parts of it, and they were all equally true, and they might not necessarily be in conflict, but the outside opinions that we put on them and the other things that we draw into those truths then is what makes it appear to be in either opposition or in a hierarchy, or different kind of the way that we interpret the truth can change, but the truth in itself is the same. We just might not, and there are some things where it's easy to see the whole truth. And sometimes you see this in reporting, actually, where there are topics when you're approaching it where you're like, okay, like I can kind of vaguely get what all the arguments are. And there are places where you're like, actually, even if I had a book to write this, I couldn't fit every single argument in. And actually, I'm on a word count, so I've got to pick out the things that are probably the most vital here. And that doesn't mean you're dismissing the other truths around it. Well, maybe it does actually, and maybe you as an individual are putting them into a lower position in your personal hierarchy. But that doesn't mean that the truths aren't still there. So I think when we're talking about truth and slithers of truth, it's really important that we think about how we accept that two people who come from opposite sides can both say something that at its core is true, and it is being flavored, and maybe the way they express it or other things they pull into it are coming from opinions rather than truth. But we shouldn't dismiss everything they say because we don't agree with part of it, or because part of it might not be a truth. You should always try and see the truth that's in there, because most of the time it is there. And I think that, yeah, that's something that I've kind of learned. And I think it's actually something that social media had, that when we talk about the role of social media in post-truth society or truth decay, the culture of opposition, the culture of trolling, the culture of I've got to get all my opinions into 280 characters, really that is where the detriment is, because we are encouraged and then that's promoted to go in swinging rather than try to see the truth underneath. And then because people are so used to getting abuse or arguments online, that actually your response then to that is to shut it down. Because like, well, I'm really, as a young female journalist, I'm fairly used to getting quite a lot of crap online. And so then I tend not to engage now, because it's, you never know which way it's going to turn. And that is a real detriment to truth, because it means you never see those other bit of kernels of truth in what other people are saying, because your automatic reaction is no. And so that is what one of the, yeah, but it's much less philosophical than John's answer.
I don't know, I found it pretty philosophical in many ways, but I think from what I was hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I was certainly getting this impression from both of you that you kind of do feel there is this sort of inner truth, there is this kernel of truth out there somewhere, and we just either have locked ourselves away from it, or we aren't open to listening or engaging, having that conversation, and kind of developing our views. So yeah, it does sound very much like sort of the Margaret Fell camp is taking over here.
I certainly do believe that, but I believe that so often in discussion, we're given a false antithesis of black or white. Yeah, and it's as though either truth is an entirely individual thing, and I say what my truth is, and no one can, they can disagree, but they can't undermine my right to my truth. Or else there is a universal divine truth, and our only job is to perceive it. I think that's a false antithesis. There's a spectrum between those two things. When we see, let us say, a mass murderer, by way of example, who thinks he or she has some kind of a mission or calling, that's an individual truth. But it is so far away from any universal norm of truth that we all reject his or her right to hold it. Yeah. And right at the other end, the fact that there's a majority vote for some point of view or opinion is not the thing that guarantees whether it conforms to some higher kind of truth or
So, yeah, I think definitely thought-provoking that, John, because I think you're right. Sort of, in a way, it seems like we do all have a certain sense of what is right or wrong in some respects, what is true, what is fact, what is fiction. But I find it very interesting, that idea of a spectrum of truth. I wonder, actually, I don't know if it's kind of link in a way, but there's been a comment actually in the chat, Georgina, kind of directed at you from Beth, which is asking why under the Convention of the House of Commons, MPs are not allowed to say that another MP is lying. I don't know if you have any particular insider knowledge on that. And she also asked, how can we get the ordinary voters get MPs to change this convention?
So basically, the reason that convention exists is because if it didn't, they'd never stop calling each other liars, and they wouldn't get anything else done. And that is the fundamental truth. So there's this concept called unparliamentary language. It's a whole list of things you're not allowed to call another MP, and it's essentially, it is the reason because they want to maintain some sort of civility in the chamber. And you hear a lot when talking about a design of Parliament. Our House of Commons, where there's two benches opposing each other, is really rare in modern parliaments. Most of them are now like a semicircle, and because of that, we have this notion, particularly strong in the UK, in the Westminster Parliament, that politics becomes very adversarial. It's very easy for it to become adversarial in the chamber, but most of the best work that happens in Westminster is the cross-party work. So the reason that these unparliamentary language conventions exist is A, to stop people wasting a load of time by calling each other liars, and B, to actually try and maintain some degree of civility, to promote cross-party working away from the chamber, which is really important. I think Beth's question is probably referring to an incident that happened before the summer, where Dawn Butler, the Labour MP for Brent, called the Prime Minister a liar and was kicked out of the Commons. Dawn Butler has since called for there to be a commitment in the Labour manifesto to change that. And also she's got an EDM, an early day motion, in Parliament, which I think about 90 MPs have signed, calling for that to change. It's parliamentary conventions all governed by Erskine May, which is very old conventions, but I think they probably could change. They just haven't. So if you really wanted to change it, then you can write to your MP and encourage them to change it, to sign the EDM. If you have a Labour MP, you can write to them and encourage them to back Dawn Butler's push to get it in the manifesto. There are lots of ways you can campaign to get that changed. I don't know, sometimes I think that people who work in Westminster become a little bit institutionalised and think that Westminster can do, the conventions are there for a reason. I actually kind of do think that this one is there for a reason. I think that the concept of actually they would never stop calling each other lies if they're allowed to is kind of true. But if you would like to get that changed, then yeah, there is work that is happening within Parliament to try and change that. So you can, yeah, Google Dawn Butler lying EDM, and I'm sure it'll come up. John, did you want to comment on that?
Well, I loved hearing it, I didn't want to comment. I just wanted to read, if it's okay, a post that Jan Arians has done during the discussion, because it's so germane to something we were discussing earlier. Jan writes, if we as friends of truth, as we used to call ourselves, are unable to back truth corporately, I would fear for our future. Meeting of friends in Wales to set up a truth and integrity group that is in the process of going yearly meeting wide, an exciting and, in my view, very welcome development. So thank you, Jan, for telling us about that.
Thank you, John, for pointing that one out. I was looking at that myself and thinking that was a really interesting comment, but there is this work going on. Potentially it will end up in Parliament, who knows?
Yeah, we were talking earlier about local initiatives, and this Welsh one might look like that. A group of friends in an area meeting, a voluntary group who are really concerned, could decide to monitor whatever public statements by the MPs who represent that district, and large industries that are based in it, and test as far as they can the truth of things being said. And they could decide they're doing this in order to publicize departures from truth. They could do it as a way of trying to get into dialogue with the people who say it. You know, there's different possibilities. But a truth and integrity group in one area, addressing one group of possible misleading or untrue statements, is a very valuable thing for a comparatively few people to do. I know, Olivia, you wanted to come on to the question of is it ever right to lie, didn't you?
That's only one thing I had in mind. I think we've got a few questions actually coming in from the participants. So I think it'd be really nice to actually answer a few of them. We can always come back to it later. The first one's come in from Ruth and James McCarthy, and they talk about how the words truth and trust may be related, and ask, does an increase in trust lead to an increase in truth? And if so, how do we pursue that?
I mean, yes, I think that an increase in trust probably would lead to an increase in truth. And the two are related. I have no idea how we do it. Absolutely none, because I think that they are so fundamentally related. It kind of like, I've seen the question that Alice has asked about truth in the media. I think a huge way to improve trust and truth, and like in this country in particular, is to actually, let's talk about the critical skills that we all need to challenge what we hear, and go away and do research, or understand our political system, or understand how our media works, and understand the establishment in which we all operate under. And actually, you almost have like this kind of looking down on subjects like media studies. I studied politics at university, and I think that that's really vital, that actually, like, if people are coming out of school not knowing the difference between left wing and right wing, or what parties are along those lines, or publications are along those lines, or the fact that, like, for example, broadcasters online are not allowed to be biased, papers are allowed to have political leanings, and that is the law. If we don't have an understanding of that, then how are we ever expecting anyone to challenge or build trust in the establishment under which we all operate? So actually, I think a huge part of improving trust is about improving understanding. And when we don't understand it, how can we trust it?
Yeah, it's very helpful to think about that. I was thinking as well about the relationship between truth and trust. And I was a little uneasy with the thought, if trust comes first, truth will follow. I was thinking of, say, Hitler, who was immensely trusted by a large part of the German population. But if you look at it the other way, I do believe that where truth comes first, trust is likely to follow. I don't particularly want to sort of go into individual names, because it could lead to arguments of disagreement which wouldn't get us very far. But this MP who was stabbed, David Amess, and Frank Field, are two MPs who I've tended to trust when I've come across their words and so on, because I've never felt they were being untruthful. The truth came first, and it bred the trust. I'm not saying they were never wrong. I'm just saying I never felt they were being untruthful.
Yeah, it sounds like a difficult one then to kind of work out whether there should be one that comes first. Whether do you put your trust in people before they've, some would say, earned it, and does truth and trust then follow from that? It's a tricky one, I think. I don't know if I'd have the answer to that at all myself. We have another question in the Q&A as well, actually a few, from Alistair Reed. And I think there's one in particular which I think is probably aimed more at you, Georgina. And Alistair writes that he's had bad experiences of lying and distortion amongst our media. He lives next to a BBC News editor and a local journalist. And the BBC in Scotland have been heavily criticised for unfairly unfairly portraying and being anti-SNP and pro the UK establishment. The local papers were criticised for being anti-immigrant. And with COP26, he's saying they've had to head off the journalist who was wanting to invent stories about Friends and threatened kind of the religious society of Friends in terms of a charitable status. And his question really is, how can we as Friends combat this lying and distortion amongst the media? And he also mentions that Georgina comments relating to Twitter limitations also apply.
So there's several different points there. The journalist who was wanting to invent stories about Friends and threatened our charitable status is obviously like, no one should be inventing stories. The fact is, what you did worked. The system does regulate itself. You managed to head them off. And like, there have been stories that have been untrue, when normally you might get a sniff of the story, and then you do a bit more digging, you find out it's untrue, and then it normally dies. So the system normally does actually regulate itself on stories that are untrue. The reputation of the BBC in Scotland is a really interesting one. I don't necessarily agree with your analysis of it, because actually the SNP have been in government in Scotland for a long time. There is always increased scrutiny on the government in power, and I think there are examples of the SNP distorting the truth as well. And there are lots of parts of the SNP's domestic record which are poor, and it's not distorting or lying to report on something being bad. And I think often outlets get reputations either way. And you see it a lot with the BBC in particular at the moment, as they get, and like, I'm not going carte blanche defending the BBC, they make a lot of mistakes, but I don't think that there is an establishment bias in the BBC in the way that a lot of people do. I think the way to combat, if you see lying or distortion in the media, there are legal routes that you can take to combat it. You can put in complaints. The complaints taken very, very seriously. The complaints process for the UK media. And I'd recommend anyone who sees something that they think is a distortion or untrue to report it. That's what the system is there for. I think as well, the media live and function and breathe in the society around them, as does everyone else. Like, actually, if we want to improve truth and trust in the media, if we want to improve truth and trust in our politicians, if we want to improve truth and trust just in general, then actually now I'm maybe coming around to John's point, and we need to do something corporately on this, because actually, like, the best way that you can combat things that you see as being problems, which are society-wide problems, is talking about it as a society-wide problem, not picking out institutions in particular which are operating as part of that wider society. And I think you can see in a lot of the way the media report, for example, on climate change has changed as the truth has become clearer. And never give up on that thought that as the truth becomes clearer, so will, and like, you can fight for the truth to become clearer and things will change around that. So yeah, I really think that came out a little bit, as I do fully accept that there are massive issues with the media and media regulation, and I know that there are valid criticisms of the BBC, but I don't think that the way that we talk about it is always necessarily helpful in actually combating the problem.
Yes, I think that there is something that we can do in this way. One thing about it, of course, is to be very careful of our own integrity. And that doesn't just mean factual accuracy. If our truth includes peacefulness and respect for others and so on, then that should affect the way that we express disagreement or point out untruth and so on. Whoever, was it you, Georgina, or someone else talking earlier about just backing off from discussions because they got so unpleasant and so abusive and personal and so on. Okay, better to back off than just to get locked into an escalating conflict, even if it's only a conflict of words. But we know that those conflicts of words do not persuade opponents. So it's always worth asking, is there another way? I can give you a very trivial example. I was asked with my wife to work in an adult education college for a day, and among other things, we were given the general studies class, which means something the kids had to do when they were longing to be back in the workshop or wherever they were actually learning their future profession. And one boy decided just to wreck it. And he did it very subtly by continually asking idiotic questions. So if I said, you know, somebody got in the car, oh, what colour was the car? And so on and on, trying to wind me up. And luckily, I didn't rise to the bait, which I might have done. And after a bit, I just said, John, his name is the same as mine, John, I think you're trying to have a fight with me, but I don't want to fight today. And he went completely silent. And about 5 minutes later, he joined the discussion again in a reasonable and engaged way. Now, that's an easy, trivial example, and probably any teacher would tell you I'd do just the same. But it applies to all kinds of contentious debates. Can we find the tone of voice and the respect where somebody actually hears us instead of just thinking, oh, she's fighting back?
I think on that as well, like, we often talk as Quakers about seeing that of God in everyone, but I think when you're approaching these conversations, maybe the most important of our little phrases we like to trot out is think it possible that you're mistaken. Because I think sometimes we go into these conversations so convinced of our own opinions or our own thought. We don't go in willing to engage with the other side, and actually you learn a lot when you're a bit more open-minded about it.
The sense I'm really getting from both of you, kind of with all of this, is that it really boils down to understanding and kind of making that attempt to understand each other, even if we aren't always agreeing, kind of being open to kind of different viewpoints, different slices of truth all coming together. And, you know, whether that's being taught at school about various things or kind of doing your own self-development. I think, yeah, it's definitely a kind of project for each one of us. And perhaps by doing that, by having our own sort of education and working together, listening to each other, maybe that is how we do kind of develop truth in the world. There's actually a comment I wanted to go back to. It was in the chat from Beth Allen, and she said earlier on, we express many of our testimonies, such as sustainability, by working alongside other much bigger groups, as well as through our individual actions. Surely we can do the truth by speaking and acting with integrity, and also by working with the many others, especially in politics, who are deeply concerned about truth in the public sphere. And I feel like that really kind of touches on the kind of two main strands which have really been running through this kind of individual responsibility, corporate responsibility. But I do really like that idea that by speaking truth to each other, perhaps we can actually live out truth better in the world.
And next time anyone who's interested in that is chatting to Paul Parker, talk to him about some of his work on the civil liberties around charities, because it's all really related to that point, because it is something I think a lot of other charities and churches are concerned about actually as well at the moment.
Just want to say one thing about the experience of working together with other groups, which I spent a lot of time doing, and that is you can find yourself within a group in the role of the conscience of the group, or feeling that you ought to be the conscience of the group when they're discussing rather dubious tactics to achieve the goals you share with them. And it's an uncomfortable position, probably one doesn't want to be in, because one's making trouble and putting an obstacle, perhaps they think, in the way of the common goal. But occasionally a role which you are actually called to play.
Thank you, friends. There have been a huge number of contributions tonight, and it's been great to hear the conversation rolling on. We have had two reading recommendations in the chat space, one from Alistair Reid recommending Trying to be Truthful by Chell Avery, which is Pendle Hill pamphlet 455, which includes queries at the back, so that might be worth looking at. And Beth Allen has recommended a read of Thomas Penny's Swarthmore lecture. I'm trying to get up in the chats, Kinder Ground, and she said, I think it will help us to think more deeply about this. So there we go, Kinder Ground and Pendle Hill pamphlet 455. Are there any final pressing questions that you'd like to pop in the Q&A before we close? If not, I'd like to say a huge thank you to both John and Georgina for their openness, the truths they have shared, the lovely examples they've shown us from real life, because that often helps us think, what might that mean for me? Because it is translating the conversation to enable some change within ourselves. And I think we've heard, haven't we, about listening to other people. We've heard about accepting that the truth may be bigger and broader than we can comprehend on an individual basis. And we have been invited to think about what we might do individually or collectively at a local or area meeting level to be witnesses for truth. So thank you all very much for this evening. Oh, and we have one final recommendation here. I'm going to see if I can roll down into this. Worth looking at the Media Reform Coalition.
Alistair wants me out of my job, clearly. Joking, Alistair. I love you, Alistair.
But that's another route to pursue, the Media Reform Coalition. So thank you all. Have a good evening or afternoon if you're elsewhere in the world. And we look forward to another meetup in February. The next Woodbrook conversation will be on reflecting on the journey, linked to the February edition of Friends Quarterly. So we look forward to seeing you and others then.